Okay, Mom, I have to give it to you, Rose said. I could definitely see myself sleeping in this. It would definitely be a nice place for a nap, but I'm really not sure if this qualifies as a home, Rose said as she got back up for a second, sitting down and looking up at her mother. Her mother simply smiled down at her before taking a seat beside her herself. Well, of course it isn't over yet, her mother replied, still that smile on her face, a look that said that Rose was about to be surprised. Remember, don't get scared. This is all perfectly normal. Well, at least where I come from. You're not in any danger. Scared by what? Rose said, before her question was immediately answered, as she saw the petals that comprised this massive flower beginning to furl back inward, reaching up, as if the flower itself was closing again. For a moment, Rose felt uneasy by it, as if she were going to be trapped in, before remembering that her mother said that she was safe. To not be afraid. So Rose did her best to calm herself, and simply trust that her mother wasn't going to bring her to any harm. As the petals of the flower closed themselves in, locking Rose and her mother within it, beginning to overlap and block out all light, leaving them in darkness there in the center of that flower. Rose couldn't help but still feel somewhat nervous, and now she couldn't see anything. It was completely dark, and then something amazing began to happen. Rose began to be able to see again, as a warm yellow glow began to alight the inside of that flower. At first she expected that it would be her mother, but was surprised to find that this warm yellow glow was actually coming from the petals of the flower that they sat in. They were beginning to glow, shining a warm yellow light down on the interior, and Rose could once again see everything. Light warmly caressing them from all directions as they sat on the furry center of that flower. Whoa, Rose said. So you can make them glow? Like you? Yes, Rose, her mother replied. As I told you before, we can make them do whatever we want. We are able to create life to fulfill our needs. Making a skyray house is no different. You will find that this flower is able to produce everything that we need. Here, inside of the safety of a skyray home, all of the amenities are provided to us by nature, the nature that we created to suit our will. Rose's mother placed her hand gently upon the furry center that they sat on, having the same look that she did when she was trying to commune with the elements, the same as before. What is she doing? Rose thought to herself. As she did, Rose began to see a vine beginning to protrude from the outside section of the furry center of the flower, growing longer and beginning to stretch towards them. On the very end, a bud began to form, opening up into a flower that had a somewhat bell-like shape to it. It was very large for a flower, especially one held on the end of a vine that seemed to move of its own accord, almost serpentine in nature. The bell eventually grew to the size of something like a basketball. It was very large. As the flower reached them, it simply hung there in the air. Come, Rose, take a look, her mother said, placing her hand gently on the bottom of the flower. and nodding her head in the direction of the interior, which you could see the opening of. Rose scooched over to her mother and began peering down into the flower. There, lit by the warm glow of this massive flower house, she could see the interior of the plant, which didn't look any different. It simply looked like the interior of a flower, like a container, but it didn't have anything in it. But that soon changed. As Rose peered into the flower, she saw a back segment, the place where the vine attached, and there was somewhat of an opening there. And from that small opening, Rose began to see what looked like water. No, not water, Rose thought. It had a somewhat more milky appearance to it. Slowly, this milky substance began to fill the flower. Oh, it's been ages since I've had this. I've craved nectar for the longest. But you can't exactly make a flower like this and not have people notice it. It requires being somewhere with lots of space and plenty of naturally occurring elements, water, earth, room to grow, and things that you can hardly find in a city, and that you definitely couldn't produce without somebody taking note of it. Without any hesitation at all, her mother placed both her hands on the bottom of this bell-shaped flower that seemed to have a petal on the bottom of it, shaped like a cone or a funnel, like the spout on a teapot. Rose's mother gently lifted up on the flower. As she did, the milky liquid beginning to flow down that funnel, and her mother drank it joyously, taking several very large gulps before lowering the flower again. As she swallowed the substance down, Rose's mother opened her mouth, releasing a sound. Oh, that is so refreshing. I must say that the nectar here still isn't quite as good as the nectar back home, but it's still very comforting. This is called nectar, Rose, her mother said, looking towards her. This is the primary food source that our people survived on. It provides to us all of the nutrition that we need, as well as tasting very good, she said with a smile. Here, try some, she said, beginning to push the flower bell towards Rose. Are you sure it's okay? Well, yes, of course it's okay, Rose's mother replied. Trust me, you'll love it. It's a taste of home. So Rose did as her mother did, beginning to drink the milk-like substance that the flower was producing, and quickly finding that her mother was absolutely right. It was delicious. It was sweet and had an interesting texture to it. Not as thick as milk, but nowhere near as thin as water, and with a very sweet taste, somewhere in between sugar and honey. Wow, that tastes great, Rose replied, as she bent the flower bell backwards. So you can really survive on this? Well, of course, Rose. Not just survive. Our people flourished. These homes provided us with everything that we needed. The nectar which we could drink to sustain ourselves, safety and warmth from the elements, as no amount of rain will ever break through the canopy top, a warm and soft place to sleep, protection from wandering animals. These homes are everything you need, all conveniently located within a single plant. An entire family stays in one of these. We all sleep here in the center. You'll find that this flower bud will actually keep you warm even in the coldest of times. Even in the dead of winter, this flower will keep you warm and and safe. There's no need for flour, for fire, as human beings have taken to. This flour produces chemicals that generate heat. It will change the balance of those chemicals based on the outside temperature. The colder it gets, the more heat that it produces. Wow, that's cool, Rose said. But that still leaves some stuff out. Oh, really? Rose's mother said, smiling in her direction. Perhaps you're wondering how one showers, her mother said, just as a large amount of water spilled across Rose, soaking her through. And Rose's mother simply laughed very loudly. Mom, your stupid flower is broken, she shouted as her mother continued to laugh. No, sweetheart, it's not broken. Forgive me, but I couldn't help myself. Rose looked up to see that a large number of the petals at the very top of the flower had curled inward and begun to spread out in, once again, a flowering pattern, except this was extended inwards into the flower. Rose could actually see small divots or holes in the petals of the flower, a countless number of them. And as Rose peered up at them, suddenly they began to produce water, one drop after another, until the drops were countless, as if it were raining inside of the flower. This time not just soaking Rose, but her mother as well. And the water was actually warm, as if it were heated water from a faucet or something like that. This plant is able to absorb water from the earth and the surrounding nature. The water travels through the flower petals and is warmed and heated, and at the very top, that water is forced through, so we can basically create rain on the inside of our flower, her mother said as the water rained down on them, soaking them both, soaking everything. Even the flower center that was furry now became damp, squishy like a rug that had been soaked in water. And that's when Rose began to notice bubbles, small bubbles creeping up from in between the strands of hair that made the furry bottom. And without a moment's hesitation, her mother reached down and began to rub the furry base. And as she did, there were suds, as if it was producing soap that bubbled to the surface. And her mother began to simply wash her hands and arms. The soap itself actually had a floral scent to it, like smelling a field of flowers. A small amount of water was building up at the bottom of the flower, but once it reached a certain level, it simply stopped increasing, as if the water was draining away somewhere else. The flower also produces its own soap, with which we can cleanse ourselves. It's completely natural in its nature, and will neither harm the flower, nor you, nor the environment. It is actually quite nutritious, and promotes growth to anything that it comes in contact with. So, with a big smile on her face, Rose began to play with the bubbles herself, and wash off just like her mother. And after they finished cleaning up, Rose began to notice the level of water at the bottom beginning to decrease as all of the water drained away, but the water overhead continued to flow until they had completely cleaned themselves off of the soap. And in rapid pace, the furry bottom of the flower rapidly began to dry out, as if all of the water that had filled it was suddenly being absorbed rapidly, drying out and fluffing up once again. And in only a moment or so, the bottom of the flower was back to being nice and dry, and just as fluffy, warm, and comfortable as it was before. Whoa, that is so cool. So it just dries itself out? Yes, Rose. As I said, Everything that we need is produced by this flower. This is a sky ray home. And when all else fails, a sky ray home will never fail to provide.